You're listening to Weekend here on the BBC World Service. My name's Paul Henley. My two guests are Dr. Paul Lowe, photographer, reader in documentary photography at London College of Communication, and Latika Burke, who's an Australian journalist and author based here in London. We'll talk about the war in Ukraine now because pressure is mounting on Germany to send German-made Leopard tanks to Kiev. The Leopard 2 is seen as a potential game-changer for Ukraine, as it is specifically designed to compete with Russian T-90 tanks, which are being used in the invasion. More than 2,000 Leopards are sitting in warehouses at the moment all over Europe. President Zelensky believes 300 of them could help to defeat Russia. Now, there was a lot of talk, but no tanks offered to Ukraine at a meeting of the Ukraine Defence Contact Group in Ramstein, a US air base in Germany. Some had expected tanks to be the new military offering for Ukraine as it prepares for a new phase in its war of attrition with Russia. And speaking via video link at the start of the meeting, President Zelensky called on countries to provide those tanks as a matter of urgency.
Time remains a Russian weapon. We have to speed up. Time must become our common weapon. Just like air defense and artillery, armored vehicles and tanks, which we are negotiating about with you.
Now, as talks progressed during the day, it became clear that Germany was yet to make that decision. Boris Pistorius is the new German defense minister.
We are not really hesitating. We are just very carefully in balance and all the pros and cons. We have to be carefully because we have a duty to look carefully and intensively on what might be the consequences for anybody in that conflict.
Ahead of the meeting, there had been reports that the Germans were looking to the United States to make a similar offer to Ukraine, offering Kiev American M1 Abrams tanks before making their move. At the start of this meeting, US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin asked countries to dig deeper to help Ukraine's war effort without specifically mentioning Germany. Here's what he had to say at a news conference at the end of the meeting.
What we're really focused on is making sure that Ukraine has the capability that it needs to be successful right now. There are tanks in those offerings. Poland, for example, continues to offer tanks and will provide tanks, and other countries will offer some tank capability as well. I don't have any announcements to make on M1s, and you heard the German Ministry of Defense say that they've not made a decision on Leopards.
Ukraine's defence minister said he'd had a frank discussion with his German counterpart about German Leopard 2 tanks to be continued. Well, for more on Germany's defence and arms supply policy, we can speak to German Member of Parliament, Markus Faber. He is a member of the Free Democratic Party, part of the governing coalition. He also sits on Germany's Defence Committee and himself is a former tank engineer in the German military. Herr Faber, welcome to Weekend. What are your thoughts on Germany not, or at least not yet, offering those tanks?
Thanks for having me. Yes, I think Germany lost an opportunity yesterday. Of course, a lot of countries are going and saying they want to deliver Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. For instance, Finland, Poland, and other countries also want to deliver battle tanks, such as Great Britain and France. So if everybody's going one direction and Germany is not moving, we could be left alone, and that is not a good situation in the alliance right now.
Yes, why? Spell it out. Is Germany isolated here?
Because everybody is moving forward, because the necessity is very high for Ukraine. I've been in Ukraine 2 weeks ago, and I talked to the Ukrainian tank brigades that freed the area of Kharkiv, and obviously they have very old Soviet battle tanks and they are running out of supplies, so they need Western replacements quite urgently.
Right, but you say everyone, quote, is moving forward. Germany apparently isn't. Why not?
So 2 points, actually. So one of the coalition partners, the Social Democrats, they still have a very, I guess, pacifist perspective, which is quite common in Germany because of our history. And the other point is that our new defense minister, it was his second day on the job. So he wants to get informed more by the MOD, the Ministry of Defense, I would have guessed they briefed him beforehand, but obviously he still has some questions that has to be answered, but I hope it can be answered quite soon.
Right. A recent poll by the public broadcaster ARD said that public opinion was split, but narrowly in favour of giving German tanks to Kiev. 46% in favour, 43% opposed. That's quite a remarkable result from a very pacifist German public. You'd think it would be a very clear indication to politicians.
It's not a clear indication to politicians, but it's always how you ask the question. If you ask, should Germany deliver military help to Ukraine? The answer is 75% yes. But if you ask, should we deliver heavy battle tanks? The answer is, as you mentioned. So I think it's about arguing within politics, so convincing the German public, and not just looking on the polls.
Well, what does the public think? That there'll be repercussions on Germany if tanks are sent?
Yeah, the public is quite split, as you mentioned.
No, but those who are worried, do they think they'll be bombed?
Yes. I think the public is quite uninformed in Germany because since the Zeitenwende speech of our Chancellor Olaf Scholz, there has not been much explanation about the issue. I think if you have such a change in perspective, such a change in politics, you have to go forward and explain. What does it mean? How is policy changed? So this didn't really happen, at least not from the members of government. So there has to be some work done, but the first step would be to go forward. We have lost a lot of time. It's the 11th month in Putin's war against Ukraine.
I can sense that you're well aware of the risks here, and that's of a very visible fracture in Western support, possibly caused by Germany. That's exactly what Moscow wants to see, isn't it?
Yes, you're absolutely right about that. I watched a lot of English-speaking media yesterday, and the question was, is Germany a reliable partner anymore? And this is the question. If it's raised, it's already a problem.
Right. Many thanks for coming on the programme and talking so frankly about it. That is German member of the Free Democratic Party, MP, Markus Faber, formerly of the German military himself. Let's go live now to Ramstein, that US airbase where the meeting happened in Germany, and speak to Idris Ali, who is Pentagon correspondent for Reuters news agency. Idris, we've talked about how reliable a coalition partner Germany is. How reliable is America? It's keen to point out extremely, isn't it?
Yeah, I think there is growing concern in Washington about what's happened over the past week or so with Germany. You know, there was an expectation that this Ramstein conference would lead to not just, a bunch of aid being delivered and talked about, which happened, but there being some major movement on the question of tanks, and that never came through. So I think there's growing concern about the United States, and where Germany stands vis-a-vis Ukraine broadly even.
Do you understand Germany's hesitancy?
I understand it on a broader level, especially given the historical concerns. But I think for the Pentagon and for the Defense Secretary and his staff, there is, sort of this sense that, yes, we understand the concern, but at the same time, we're talking about Ukraine, which is, being severely hit by strikes, by Russian forces, and whatever these concerns are have to be overcome. And I think there's also an understanding that eventually Germany will give the tanks. So why not do it now, given that there's growing concern about a Russian counteroffensive or a Russian offensive in the coming months?
Look, everyone else clearly had the same concerns, including the UK and the US at the start. Provision of any arms to Kiev was seen as a possible cause of nuclear war. Those have subsided, those fears, to this extent, have they? Is Washington entirely confident that handing over tanks won't spark anything huge?
I mean, I think their lack of concern on this is based on history. There was concern that there would be sort of this escalation when the United States gave HIMARS systems. There was concern, that might be an escalation when they gave their Patriot systems. And what we've seen sort of over the past few months is Russia may talk about how, they may respond, but they rarely do. And part of the reason is their military right now isn't really capable of doing much in terms of threatening countries outside of Ukraine. And so I think the point the Biden administration is making to Germany is, look, tanks, while they might seem escalatory, are very, very unlikely to actually be able to go to the front lines. They'll, probably be hit by Russian forces pretty easily, just given how big they are. So I think the point that they're trying to make is that the tanks might actually be one of the less escalatory things, and they're not too concerned about Russia responding.
And the US will go ahead unilaterally with providing tanks, will it?
The US is not in current talks to actually provide their Abrams tanks. The sense is that the United States has provided about $27 billion in aid, and they're continuing to provide it. But the issue with the American tanks is that they're just too difficult to maintain. The Abrams tanks use a jet engine, and they require jet fuel, something which Ukraine doesn't have much of. And so the point they have been making is if we, the Americans, give Abrams tanks, it'll be a bigger problem for the Ukrainians to try and use, rather than helping them. And they've said, look, if Germany and other countries can give their Leopard tanks, it overcomes the issue of maintenance, fuel, logistics, and really would help the Ukrainians.
It's maybe worth referring to the league table of military aid, international military aid to Ukraine at the moment, which the US leads by a very long margin. Germany, however, even though it's not contributing certain weaponry, is, I believe, second in that league, isn't it? It's not as if it's not playing an important role.
No, it is. It is. You're right. It's second, and I think that's forgotten in many times. And, for the Germans to give their Mardar armored vehicles, which they announced a couple of weeks ago, they're giving a Patriot system. So, I think the flip side of this debate is that Germany has probably gone a lot further than many people thought when the war started.
And if you can put it in a sentence or two, what's the Pentagon's assessment of how the war is going so far?
The Pentagon, I think, believes the war is going far better than they suspected it would 11 months ago. The Ukrainians are not only able to hold down in the capital and territories, but they're now making counteroffensives and pushes. So it's going a lot better than I think a lot of people thought it would.
Many thanks for coming on the programme live from Ramstein in Germany. That's Idris Ali, who is Pentagon correspondent for the Reuters news agency. What did you think of his assessment, of the Pentagon's assessment, Paul, of the progress in the war?
Well, the Ukrainians have been incredibly clever and incredibly inventive at using whatever weapons they've been given to defend themselves and indeed counterattack. So at the beginning of the war, the javelins and NLAWs they were given, they used very, very successfully to ambush Russian columns and take out Russian tanks. Then they used this swarm tactics in the Kharkiv counteroffensive of using light armored vehicles like Humvees to kind of go around the edges and break through Russian lines and isolate Russian combat positions. And then when they've been given these position guided munitions like HIMARS and the very accurate artillery systems, they combine that with drone observation to take out, Russian command centers and ammo depots and so on. So when they're finally given tanks, I think they'll be equally inventive and equally creative and equally effective at using them. I think it's absolutely right to say the Leopard is the right tank. At the end of the day, the Abrams is they've already got far too many weapon systems because they've been given this sort of mishmash of different vehicles from different countries and so on.
I think US General Petraeus called it a petting zoo of an array of weapons.
Absolutely. But on the other hand, they've been very effective at using them. I mean, for example, the Leopard anti-aircraft gun the Germans have given is essentially it's a tank chassis with an anti-aircraft gun fitted on the top, and that's been very successful at taking out Russian drones and UAVs and missiles and so on. So they really are very, very good at using what they've been given. But as he said, it's a year into this conflict now, and I think we've really it's incredible it's taken this long to really accept that the Ukrainians are capable of defending themselves and indeed capable of taking territory back, and we should be giving them the weapons to be able to allow them to do that. But the Leopard is the right tank for that.
Latika, what about the UK's contributions in weaponry to the war in Ukraine?
Yeah, so the UK's most recent donation to the Ukrainians is to send a squadron of Challenger 2 tanks. Now, these tanks, as described to us, will mainly be effective for the Ukrainians in actually night scouting. So they've got great night vision gear on them, and that they will stop have a look at what's up ahead, and that's the best use of those tanks. Now, that's not exactly what we might imagine battle tanks being used for, and it does show that there's shortcomings in what the UK's capability is going to offer them. At any rate, 14 tanks is not going to change the outcome on the battlefield, is it? What the Ukrainians really do need are these tanks for all the reasons described, and also don't underestimate the spare parts component. You know, there's a supply of spare parts, there's a history of weapons manufacturing of these tanks and their supports needed on the continent, and that's really vital, being able to get those parts across to Ukraine quickly.
And what about public support for weaponry being shipped from the UK to Ukraine? Is there less fear now?
Look, I think this winter was really instrumental in all of this. If we'd had a terribly, terribly cold winter in Europe and people were really, really suffering in terms of energy, that might have come into the equation of perhaps eroding some public support. We have not seen that. The British people, and I think by and large also people on the continent, are very supportive of their governments, aiding, equipping and arming Ukraine to do what it can to defeat this Russian invasion. Why tanks now? I mean, the way it was described to us is that the officials are very, very impressed with Ukraine's ability to adapt to what it's been given on the battlefield. And now is the time that they think Russia is particularly on the back foot. Russia, of course, is regrouping. It's re-equipping ahead of a spring offensive, but they also believe that Russia is suffering a severe morale boost. Ukrainians are the opposite, and that tanks at this point may really be decisive. Nobody wants a long, protracted stalemate. I think you would really come up to some problems there if this goes on for several years, and people's energy bills are feeling this for many, many years to come. I think people are willing to put up with it for a measure of time. Indefinitely, not so much.
You're listening to the BBC World Service. I'm Paul Henley with Weekend.